you for joining us on Fox 9 and Fox Local. I'm Amy Hockert.
Yeah, the polls closed here in Minnesota, and actually in 12 states the polls are closed right now. So we're going to be getting some results here, and we already have some states that have been called tonight. We are joined by our political science professor, David Schultz. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
My pleasure.
We look forward to talking with you throughout the evening. So let's take a look at what's at stake first. Voters in 15 states and America Samoa went to the polls today, and we have learned the results in the Democratic caucus in Iowa. So let's begin with Republicans. More than 1,200 delegates are needed to secure the nomination. 36% of those delegates are up for grabs tonight. So, David, is there anything that you're seeing here tonight that gives any hope at all for Nikki Haley? Vermont, we know, too close to call.
That's right. At this point, no. Right now, is that, as you point out, 36% is up at this point. Haley needs some big victories, not just close, but big victories in some big states like California, some of the other more popular ones. Even if she does a whole bunch of, let's say, 60-40s, Trump wins 60, she gets 40, she actually has to win real states at this point. And the polls aren't suggesting that she's going to do that. And some of the earlier results are also suggesting she's not going to get any clear victories.
All right, more than a third of the delegates up for grabs on this Super Tuesday. We want to take a look now at those delegates as they shake out. Let's see if we have any of those numbers for us.
Well, we know that President Trump has to get to 1,215. He started the night with 273, and he's up to 297.
That's right. Nikki Haley with 43. We know that she took Washington, D.C. as recently as this past weekend. So we'll see how this shakes out. And again, as Kelsey just said, Vermont too close to call right now.
Yeah. And then do we have the delegate count for Joe Biden as well? He needs 1,968 to win the nomination. He started tonight with 206 delegates.
Yeah, and it's important to mention, by the way, these are estimates at this point, obviously, but they're pretty close estimates. And neither Biden nor Trump can win enough delegates tonight to be able to get the nomination. But they're
getting closer.
They're getting close within the next 2 to 3 weeks. This could be about the earliest we have ever seen on both sides wrapping up really the primaries. I mean, potentially by the end of March it's over.
Okay, so election alerts tonight. These are the states where the races have been called so far. We want to start now with Virginia. Let's bring those numbers where Donald Trump has been declared the winner in Virginia. And Trump also, we want to go to North Carolina now. Projected winner in North Carolina.
And then President Trump also, or former President Trump also the projected winner for Tennessee. And switching over to the Democrats now, President Biden, the projected winner in Virginia, 99 delegates on the line there. We need to catch up just a little bit. We're still on Tennessee, but it's what we're seeing, David, as you just said, is what we expected going in tonight. These were the dominant front runners.
Right.
This continues tonight on Super Tuesday, where in the past, Super Tuesday was a time to really shake out who was going to be a front runner because you still had a number of candidates in the mix.
No, you're right. Generally, you would think of Super Tuesday as kind of a gatekeeper, that it sort of closes the door on some candidates but doesn't sort of end it. But think about it here. Both Biden and Trump are running essentially as incumbents. I mean, one's a president, one's a former president. They both have, let us say, pretty strong support in the party, but we're going to talk more about that in a few minutes here. But they have such a dominant position in both of their parties that neither Nikki Haley nor, in the case of Minnesota, Dean Phillips, really are mounting enough of a serious challenge against them.
And we've been showing folks on our screen here some of the other projected winners, Donald Trump in Massachusetts as well. And as we go through these numbers, David, obviously a lot of people watching Nikki Haley tonight because there's not a lot else to watch. We kind of know what's going to shake out. But as far as Nikki Haley goes, out of this, where does she go from here, assuming that Donald Trump takes all, maybe she gets one out of this, but where does she go after tonight?
Well, the challenge for her is how far and how long she can actually continue to campaign. At some point, the money will start to run out. And as we know, I was going to say, what's the line? 90% of a campaign is money. I don't know what the other 10% is, but 90% is the money. That's going to dry up pretty rapidly. So she's got to figure out where to go. I think her strategy is a long haul strategy. I think she wants to be the person in place in the Republican Party that a few months down the line, if something were to happen to Trump, and we have to be honest and say that, you know, he's still facing potentially 4 criminal trials, 91 indictments. I think she wants to be the person that says, listen, if for some reason he's no longer the nominee, a criminal conviction, and again, presumption of innocence till proven guilty, but she wants to be in a position of saying, I'm the alternative. I'm the person to replace him. So I think that's what she's really hoping for, is positioning herself in that play.
And she has said, you know, I'll stay in this as long as I'm competitive. And so I guess she could kind of define that on her own terms.
That's right.
She has D.C. and then Vermont is very close right now. And she has the governor of Vermont's endorsement too. So, you know, she can stay in on her own terms as long as she feels like she maybe has some money source and is competitive enough to see what happens over the next few months.
Right.
We want to take a look at the delegate count now for Biden in the states that have been called so far, if we can pull up those counts. And again, 12 states have already, their polls have closed.
That's right.
Virginia and Vermont were the earliest to close at 7 o'clock Eastern time, 6 o'clock Central time. And so Biden, the projected winner in Virginia tonight. And Vermont, Biden, the projected winner there as well.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, North Carolina, we have a projected winner of Joe Biden. And then we're going to move on to Tennessee. We're going to try to take these a little slowly so our computer system can catch up with us. Tennessee, and then I think Maine is coming up next. So again, the projected winner, Joe Biden. As we know, Dean Phillips was in this mix, and I don't know if this is the time to bring him up in this conversation as we're sort of waiting, and our folks can kind of watch the states as they are up in the screen here. Yeah,
I think it's worth noting at this point is the fact that I think he's in maybe even a less or in a more precarious position than Nikki Haley. I mean, Haley has won a state, you know, she's getting, you know, double digits. Dean Phillips is not. I would be surprised if he does well at all in Minnesota. He's really alienated himself from the, you know, the core of the Democratic Party, who's showing up for the primary are hardcore Democrats at this point. So for him, it's going to be the same issue. What does he do tomorrow? Does he still say he wants to keep going on, that he wants to keep challenging Biden? Again, does the money run out? He's going to have to make those choices also. Now remember, when he first declared to run, his whole reason for declaring to run is to give voters an opportunity to pick somebody besides Joe Biden. But now, and something else we want to talk about here, where there's a small kind of uncommitted options in Minnesota and across the country, does he kind of lose some of his rationale because people can now say essentially uncommitted or none of the above?
Can we dig a little bit more into that while we wait for these Minnesota numbers, which we don't have any yet, polls just closed. But let's talk about that uncommitted voters. Who are they, and how does their statement sort of fit into the landscape here? And again, we're taking a look at Minnesota numbers, of which we have none at this time, Dave. Okay, now we know in Michigan, where they had that option, it was really a combination of two different types of individuals. One, it was younger voters, that is people under the age of 30, who were not overly enamored by Joe Biden, but also Michigan had a fairly large concentration of people with kind of who were Arab Americans, Muslim, and we have to remember Minnesota has a very, very heavy concentration of people who are also Muslim, and that could be a factor in the race. Now, do I think it's going to change the result? No, but what it could do is a couple of different things. One, it could lead to a certain percentage of people voting uncommitted, but also one of the other things I'm looking at in Minnesota and nationwide tonight is not just how big the victories, but how many people are showing up. It's really the enthusiasm factor. And we know from polling that about 60% of the American public is not overly excited to see a rematch of Trump versus Biden. We know even within the parties, there's significant percentages of Democrats or Republicans not excited about that either. And I think the turnout is going to give us some indication about the passion or how much people care about the election. Remember, 4 years ago, we had, what was it, like almost 80% turnout, for the primary. I mean, just absolutely astronomical. We don't have good numbers yet, but I'm suspecting we're going to be at least half of that. And nationwide, I don't think we're going to see the same turnout we did before. What I'm getting at here is tonight will give us an idea of how passionate people are about the potential
Trump versus Biden rematch.
I want to come right back to that voter turnout question.
Good.
But we want to show Vermont numbers because we have some fresh numbers. And this is the state that is too close to call in the Republican primary right now. It's essentially tied, but Nikki Haley has a slight lead over maybe just about 30 minutes ago, but only 40% of precincts reporting. So we'll keep an eye on this one. Again, she has the endorsement of the Republican governor in the state of Vermont, and this is a state with a lot of independents. But in the other states that have been called so far, it is pretty heavily weighted toward Donald Trump. So going back to the voter turnout issue, though, again, we all had different experiences at the polls. We saw Rob Olson out at a precinct in Bloomington today. Very, very light turnout, which is so odd for Minnesota, which always historically has one of the highest turnouts in the country. So I'm wondering, you teach young people demographically, and I don't know that we'll get these numbers tomorrow when we see the turnout, but what is your suspicion when it comes to the ages of the people who are coming out to vote, and if there's any interest for young people?
Yeah, first off, my sense is if we could actually get the numbers, it's going to be an older demographic voting. There's no question about that, because just in general, my easiest prediction is to say younger people are less likely to vote. But if I can use my students at Hamline University as, I guess, a small sample, when I was talking to them on Monday, the sense in terms of them just not excited at all about the race, for all kinds of reasons. Again, some of my students are Muslim, some of them are just looking at it and saying, remember, this is my students speaking here. They're saying it's two really old people. They just don't see themselves. They don't see themselves, or they see these candidates as being able to identify with them. And I think that's going to be an issue because the Democrats won, and Biden won 4 years ago because of huge turnouts among the three critical swing voters: people of color, young people, and college-educated suburban women. All indications are right now that especially those under the age of 30 are incredibly uninterested in this race and really don't see any viable options here. And if that were to happen, that just makes it even harder for Biden in terms of running. But just in general, what it's going to tell us, again, is something more about not just that race, but remember, this is a race tonight only about the presidency, at least for here. The down ballot issues. If young people don't show up to vote, if people of color don't show up to vote, if college-educated suburban women don't show up to vote, and there's some indications that may happen this year, this has really kind of a down ballot trickle-down effect in terms of all the elections across the country.
We want to check in now with our Rose Schmidt as it pertains to this turnout question, because she has been out there tonight sort of gauging how people are doing. Some people, Rose, we have been talking about it, they think this race is over before it even got started. So what have you heard from folks out there tonight?
Well, Amy, the truth is not every voter is thrilled with the choices that were in front of them today. One man even explaining to us that when elections aren't competitive, he still feels it's important to vote because it's his way of expressing his opinions.
I'm not particularly excited about anyone on the ballot, but it's important to, use what little voice I have.
It wasn't a strong excitement about the candidates that led these South Minneapolis voters to the polls on Super Tuesday. Still, they make a point of casting a ballot on Election Day, regardless of the choices.
Building the habit and continuing to vote, making sure I do it every year. It's just a good habit for me to be in.
We need to support the elected officials that we think will do a good job or have been doing a job. And I think Joe Biden has been really underrated.
Others at Bryant Square Park recognizing that this election could be a foregone conclusion, as President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump remain the frontrunners.
I don't think I would have come out to vote had there not been the protest movement for the uncommitted vote, because I think that is the case, that we are pretty locked into the two candidates as they stand right now.
Naomi Vaughn calling this a system of the best worst options. She says voting uncommitted was her way of lodging her complaint about the handling of the Israel-Hamas war.
Uncommitted vote has been like an effective way of just showing numbers of dissatisfaction. I think in Michigan, when it was 100,000 voters voting uncommitted, that was like a pretty powerful statement.
And 3 of the 4 voters who we interviewed there did specifically mention to me that the Israel-Hamas war was a top issue that brought them to the polls here today. Reporting live in South Minneapolis, Rose Schmidt, Fox 9.
All right, thanks, Rose. And again, our Super Tuesday coverage continues here on Fox 9. We'll be back on Fox 9 at 9 o'clock and 10 o'clock, but we have the special coverage on Fox Local right now as we look at the 16 states and one American territory that are voting for Super Tuesday. So many delegates up for grabs. I mean, in California alone, 169, and then in Texas, 161. And in 12 states, the polls have already closed tonight. That includes Minnesota closing at 8 o'clock tonight, and we'll get some results from Minnesota here in just a bit.
Yeah, and mathematically, former President Trump could not clinch the nomination tonight, is my understanding, even if he swept all of these states. It sounds like we do have Minnesota now, so let's go to the numbers that we do have. So 1% of those precincts reporting here, 75 to 23% for Nikki Haley. You can see the vote count there, and the difference with the Republican side. And I don't know if we have, here we go. So this is the Democrats now, Joe Biden. And so 77% for Joe Biden. And again, it's a very small sampling here, but David, uncommitted, we're showing 13%, and Dean Phillips had 8%. So what are your thoughts? Just taking a look at this snapshot.
Well, first off, Dean Phillips probably does not want to come in behind non-committed at this point.
Right.
Okay, it's his home state. This is probably not good for him. But what I do think is interesting is the uncommitted at about 13% at this point. Again, it's speaking to a small but consistent portion of the Democratic Party that again is not excited by the option right now. And what's even more interesting about this is that we're looking at, on a primary night, the hardcore Democrats who are showing up, in this case here. These are the people who are loyal, same on the Republican side. And the fact that you're still getting, 13 or 14%, again, it's going to obviously change, that are saying no. Again, it speaks to that issue. And if we get to a general election, both Biden and Trump need to get 90% of their own party people to vote for them. And if you now start to get these kind of defections, I'm going to throw out something else we haven't talked about here, is that some people might stay home on election day, but remember, we're going to have some third-party candidates on the ballot. We're going to have RFK, Robert Kennedy Jr. We're going to have a couple of other candidates out there, and oftentimes when there's third-party candidates, instead of people staying home on election day, they vote for the third-party candidates in part as a protest vote. So we want to start to think about what scenarios down the line could be if we now have 2 or 3 perhaps third-party candidates, and what it might mean.
We don't want to get too far down the road
right,
here.
Sure.
You don't have a crystal ball, but who might those factions lean toward? I mean, as we're talking about the uncommitted and the RFK voters, who will that break?
Well, normally I would say that the third-party candidate divides the anti-incumbent vote, which basically means that it's a protest vote. People who would be voting for Trump as a protest against Biden might say, I don't like Trump, I'm going to vote for RFK Jr. or something. Right now, the polls are suggesting that it's actually hurting Biden a little bit more than it is hurting Trump, because a couple of the candidates, such as the Green Party candidate, such as Cornel West, who's running as sort of the socialist candidate, are pulling more progressive votes from Biden. But again, as we get closer to the election, and obviously there's just so many balls up in the air, so many variables here, I'll simply say that this gives people who can't vote uncommitted or none of the above an option to say, instead of staying home, I can go somewhere else. And I always want to come back and tell people, remember, at the end of the day, this election is going to come down to what? About 6 states. It's going to be about 6 states that matter. It sounds really pessimistic to say this. Probably 150,000 voters are going to matter in this election. We are so polarized. We know that about 45, 44 states, we know what's going to happen in Texas, New York, California, Massachusetts. There's just a small handful of states, maybe, I don't know, maybe Minnesota's one of them, and it's going to be a few swing voters in a few swing states that really decide the election.
Yeah, that's been our pattern in recent years, really starting in 2000 with that close election. David, I know you've been keeping a close eye on the conventions and the rules in particular as we watch the landscape of this presidential election. And you're looking at the age issues for both candidates. It's become an issue for people who are questioning whether Biden should be running. You're looking at whether or not there could be a medical political issue going into the conventions.
Correct.
What do the conventions do at that point? And then you have Trump with these criminal cases that are set to go to trial.
Yeah.
So as you're watching the months, creep on, and we start to get through these primaries, and you're looking at the conventions, what are the scenarios that you're running through your head, and what the conventions could be facing?
Okay, there's a lot of scenarios here. Okay, so assume for the sake of argument that Biden and or Trump get enough delegates going into the convention that they can win on the first round. That has one scenario here. And if they do, but there's a medical emergency or something else that occurs, unless Trump or Biden were to release the delegates, they're committed to vote for them on the first round there. Now, if that weren't to happen, let us say, for example, there's a serious medical emergency or something else that happens to both of them, and certainly none of us are hoping that's going to happen. But given the age and given some of the concerns, it's a possibility. What we might see happen is that they might have to change some of the rules at this point at the convention in terms of what to do if suddenly a candidate is not available. Some people might remember in this state, Minnesota, we had a generation ago, we had Paul Wellstone's plane crash 11 days before the election. And the reason why I mention this, think about a series of scenarios. Something happens where one of the candidates going into the convention has to leave. Another scenario, once they've gotten the nominations, but before early ballots have been mailed. And then another scenario, we're going to start to early vote in Minnesota about the last week of September, across the country also too. What if, for some reason, a criminal conviction, a medical emergency? We've got all these different scenarios. Now, neither the Republican nor the Democratic Central Committees can push somebody off the ticket if something happens. On the other hand, if there's a vacancy for a medical reason, something, they have an ability to be able to pick somebody to go into place. And I think that's something we have to be thinking about here as a possibility. Now, some people have asked me, and they said, okay, what if, for example, Biden gets the nomination, assuming Harris is still the VP, and what if, for example, he has to leave the ticket for some reason? Does that automatically mean that Harris goes up to the president? No, it does not. There's no sort of like, I don't know, what are you going to call it, consolation prize. It would be up to the Democratic Central Committee or the Republican Central Committee to make their decision regarding who would fill that vacancy. The reason why we're talking all about this, I've never had to talk about this in 30 years of teaching before, is that we've got variables, we've got issues in this race we have not seen in American history before. Again, no one's making
the court cases.
We have the court cases. We've never had a former president or a candidate running with this pending court cases. We haven't had two candidates this old ever run before, of which, again, there are people who are concerned about, could there be, again, a medical emergency that affects one or both of them? So we're dealing with scenarios that we've not seen before. And given the fact that we now have an increasingly higher percentage of the public that's voting in advance of Election Day, again, 45 days out, if something were to happen in October, the ballots are already printed, people have already cast ballots, what do? How do we reallocate those ballots? We don't have good answers to these questions, and we're going to probably start to confront that. My prediction will be, if any of these scenarios happen, the election lawyers across the country are going to make a fortune, because there's going to be all types of litigation in the courts surrounding all these different kind of scenarios at this point.
Like 2000 again.
It's getting the feel like 2000, except remember 2000, the litigation was afterwards. Now, potentially, you're going to see the litigation before. But just to sort of play it out one more, what if somebody after the general election, but before the Electoral College meets, has a medical emergency or there's a conviction? Or what if after the Electoral College in December casts his votes, but before the person is sworn in or before Congress counts the electoral votes, somebody has to leave the race? That's what I'm saying. Think of, we've got so many, can I call them choke points or whatever? Like, we got so many choke points in the system right now that we have to be thinking about in terms of how it potentially could affect who eventually gets sworn in on January 20th.
a conviction for Donald Trump, for instance, we've talked about as well, he could continue to run. A lot of people have asked,
correct,
what if he's convicted criminally? Could he continue? And the answer is
yes, he can.
Okay.
Yes, he can.
Let's take a quick look and get you caught up here. We want to check in on Vermont because we do have a little bit more of a picture here. 46% reporting at this point, and you can see Donald Trump just edging that lead over Nikki Haley. So we'll keep a close eye on that. And then I think we also have some Minnesota numbers here. I'm not sure how many. Oh, we're going to have that in just a second here. I want to ask you, David, about Minnesota. You mentioned potentially being a swing state, maybe, maybe not. Can you talk a little bit more about that? And if Minnesota does become a swing state, and let me just pause for 1 second here. We've got a little bit more. So 2% reporting, and Donald Trump showing 76% over Nikki Haley's 22, and you can see the differential in the actual vote count there. But again, very, very early on. Polls just closing here about 25 minutes ago. Oh, there we go. Dean Phillips, and then the uncommitted. 10% and 79 for Biden, been declared the winner in Minnesota. So again, those uncommitted and Phillips numbers not moving much there, but I do want to ask you a little bit about the swing state aspect of this and what that looks like for each of these candidates moving forward on the campaign trail and how Minnesota would fit into that.
Okay, so again, it's been for about the last 30 years. I mean, it started off a few years ago. This is my research, by the way, a lot of the work that I do. 10 states, I thought a few years ago, were really in play. We're down now to probably about 5 or 6 states that are truly in play. And these are the states, for example, like Wisconsin, Michigan, Arizona, Georgia, Pennsylvania. And that's where the big focus is going to be. When we get to the general election, that's where the candidates for the last few years have spent most of their time, most of their dollars, most of their effort. Now, many people were not thinking that Minnesota was a swing state, but remember, in 2016, Trump got within, I think if I remember correctly, 90,000 votes of winning the state of Minnesota. Now, part of it was the fact that Secretary Clinton made a major mistake. She thought she had the state wrapped up, didn't campaign here. Trump has said, and said as recently as just a few days ago, he really wants to win Minnesota. I mean, no Republican has won Minnesota at the presidential level since 1972. If he decides to come here and campaign, it's going to force Biden here to campaign, and we're going to see a lot of political ads.
And Minnesota has been called for Donald Trump, with 76% of the vote so far, with 2% of the precincts reporting. But again, of the other states that have been called, you are seeing this very lopsided victory. I mean, so much of the vote is going to Donald Trump, except in Vermont, where it is still very much a close race. And the only other the only other win that Nikki Haley has is D.C. right now. So the question would be whether or not she could stay in after Super Tuesday, when so many of the delegates would go to Donald Trump, and he's so much closer to clinching this nomination.
So is she playing the long game here, I guess is the question, right?
Yeah, she's definitely playing the long game. I think where she wants to be at some point is going into the convention is to be able to say, again, if Donald Trump were convicted, let's say, of some criminal charge, and remember, it's 4 cases, there's actually 4 different trials, of which 91, possible indictments here. Some of these could occur. In fact, we have one trial that's going to probably start later this month in New York. But I think she wants to be in a position of saying, all right, he's a flawed candidate. He's been convicted. I'm the alternative. I think she wants to be there. Now, is she guaranteed to be because she's runner-up? No. But I think she wants to make that argument. And what's interesting about her argument also, again, if polls are to be believed, and they're actually fairly accurate, believe it or not, in a head-to-head matchup between Haley versus Biden, she wins big on a national one. She has a bigger lead over Biden than Trump does at this point. And that's a pretty strong argument for her at this point in terms of saying that I can beat Biden by about 10 percentage points.
That's the interesting factor is the national polling. Well, we're going to wrap up our Fox Local coverage for Super Tuesday, and we will have more on our 9 o'clock news and our 10 o'clock news. David Schultz, thank you so much for joining us tonight to give us some analysis of all of these states that are voting today. 16 states in one territory. That's a lot of delegates, and we still have California to come with its 169 delegates, Utah and Alaska. But I mean, the story story was pretty much told by about 8 o'clock tonight.
Correct.
Which way this was going to go. A Super Tuesday unlike any other Super Tuesday that we've seen before, where we usually still have many other candidates still in the mix.
It might be more of a mediocre Tuesday.
That's right.
That's right.
We'll see how the rest of the campaign
That's right.
goes,
That's right.
right?
That's
And
right. Exactly.
we'll be talking to you about turnout tomorrow.
Great. Perfect. Good.
All
Thank you
right.
for having me.
Thanks, David. And you can catch us here coming up at 9 o'clock on Fox 9 News at 9. We'll see you then.
Leaves it up to Congress to do it, not the states. So the point is, that doesn't mean anybody's defending Trump. That doesn't mean that he couldn't be held to account. It means that if he were to be held to account, it has to be done through Congress. That's all that the opinion meant. But to answer your question, other states will not, cannot go ahead and try to kick him off ballots now.
You know, Randy, we didn't bring you on last night, but I'm sure you have lots of thoughts about that ruling yesterday, unanimous 9-0. Did you think that too? Doug Burns, he called it unanimously. Did you?
There was never a question in my mind that the Supreme Court of the United States was going to say there is no state that is going to unilaterally dictate who's going to be on the ticket. And it comes down to something as simple as the notion of engaging in insurrection. It's not self-executing. Someone actually has to determine that the former president actually engaged in the insurrection. So to me, it was really silly for anyone to think that that argument would have legs. The immunity argument is a much closer call, but certainly not the question of, can you kick him off the ballot?
So, you know, the Supreme Court will have to answer one of these other pressing constitutional questions on the issue of presidential immunity. Doug, you don't think Trump will be as successful or victorious as he was last night on that question, do you?
Well, everybody's got to understand, it's so interesting that the kicking him off the ballot is a legal question, and that is, who does it, Congress or the states? The insurrection thing is a factual question, quite honestly, and Randy's 100% right. It's going to be much, much more of a real horse race, to put it in